Welcome back. 412-575-2600. That is the number on the Borders and Borders hotline to give us a call. Josh Taylor, former Steelers linebacker Ryan Shazier on a special edition of the Ireland Contracting Nightly Sports Call. We are taking your questions about this Steelers' second preseason win against the Buffalo Bills, 27-15, the final score. We are going to start with Mike in Wilkinsburg. Mike, you're on the Nightly Sports Call. Contracting Nightly Sports Call. We are taking your questions. Mike, turn your TV down, please, and give us your question. What you got?
Okay, I haven't turned my TV yet.
What you got for us, Mike?
Hey, I just want to say.
Go ahead.
I just want to say the Steelers looked real good. They looked very good, man. They did.
Appreciate the call. It's hard to argue with it, Ryan. They did look pretty good. We talked about it in different phases of the game. And honestly, this is one thing we haven't really gotten into. But we talked a lot about, the defense from the linebacker side of things. This defensive line also, I think, is something we need to kind of get into. And I discussed it a little bit with Chris Hoke on last week's show. But I want to ask you about this question because we saw guys like Keanu Benton making some plays and Isaiah Loudermilk getting after it. What do you see from the Steelers defensive line, especially with all the changes that have been made there in the offseason? We've been talking about the offensive line and the linebackers. There's a lot of turnover at defensive line, too.
The team has just done a great job. Omar Khan and Andy have done a really good job of just setting up the whole defensive front. So they brought in veteran presence in the linebacker and the DB position. But when you think about the D-line, we have a lot of younger pieces, and then their veteran presence is Cam Hayward. So having Cam Hayward as a veteran presence, as a leader of this team, like he has been for the last 7 years, man, there's nobody better to learn from. And now you're seeing Leal, you're seeing Keanu Benton, and you're seeing some of these younger players starting to make plays, and they're creating more depth just like they have at every other position. And I think that's one thing that we're learning from just the past years and the past things that we're seeing around the league. The more depth you have in key positions, the better your team is going to play. And I'm really excited about just this whole defensive front, and especially with what the young guys are doing. Yeah,
you mentioned DeMarvin Leal, and you mentioned Keanu Benton. Then there's Isaiah Loudermilk. By the way, Benton and Loudermilk, both Wisconsin guys, yeah. Big Ten guys, to point that out. But they're also guys that were all drafted by this organization. They're all internal guys that were brought in. So you're seeing that rebuilding process. It's homegrown. It's not just you're using a bunch of money being pumped in to guys that are brought in through free agency, although there have been a couple guys. We can't leave that part out. But it does speak to a lot when you're seeing homegrown guys brought into this organization, and this is the first thing they're introduced to, and they're able to plug in so quickly. Let's shift over to Buena Vista. That's where Jim is. Jim, you're on the Nightly Sports Call.
Yes, I'd like to say, give a shout out to Ryan Shazier. It's great to see him. I was wondering how he felt about maybe Warren getting the leading role this year. He's produced a lot more, in my opinion, than Harris, and I was wondering, Bob Pompiani brought it up, and Chris Hook said that it was impossible, and I just wanted to know how you guys felt about it.
All right, Ryan, this is all you.
Yeah, so I think that Jalen Warren is a really good back, and the one thing that I really like about Jalen, I'm sorry about that, is that he does a really good job of just changing tempo. He has his tempo is completely different than Najee's tempo is. But the one thing that I say is different between Najee and Jalen is Najee is your workhorse. He's your bell cow. He's the guy, he might get 3 yards here, but he might get 10 yards here, but you know what you're going to get from him. You're going to get around 4 to 5 yards every run. You know you're going to get somebody. If the passing game isn't looking well that day, we can hand it off to him, and you know what you're going to get. I think with Jalen, he's a very good back. He's a spell back. I think he's a change of pace back, third down back, somebody that can really help this team change up the looks that we're trying to give somebody. And I definitely feel, depending on what team, it can be a Tony Pollard and Ezekiel Elliott situation when Tony Pollard in certain situations, he might get more touches, and then in another situation, Najee would get more touches. But I don't know if Jalen is the guy to take over the job right now, because I think that's still Najee's to lose because the past 2 seasons he's had, even though last year he had a bit of injuries.
You bring up a good point, because Dallas, I think, is a pretty good example of that, where you're talking about, teams that are using running back by committee. And it's a trend that's starting to, happen around the league now. You're seeing more and more teams do it. And to your point, you wanted Jalen Warren to make some big plays here and there. You want to change a pace guy. I feel like a Najee Harris, that's a guy you want in the second half when you got a lead and it's the late in the third, it's the fourth quarter, and he's a guy that's going to punish DBs. He's going to make it harder on linebackers. He's going to wear defenses down. And we saw that in the second half of the season last year where he's wearing down teams like Atlanta and Carolina and Cleveland, where he's really getting after those teams because he's a guy that's so tough to bring down. He kind of likes that physical contact, and he can wear a defense down over time.
Yeah, I can completely agree with you because if you look at the beginning of the season, obviously he had an injury to what he was dealing with. But if you look at his stats at the beginning of the season compared to his stats at the end of the season, when it starts to get cold, even though he's an Alabama running back, but it doesn't make sense. When it starts to get cold, when you have to start giving somebody a lot of touches, when guys don't want to get hit because it's too cold outside, that's when Najee shows up and be the big bad wolf. And I think that's the type of guy that Pittsburgh wants, especially because as this team continues to grow, as this team is what everybody in Pittsburgh wants it to be, if we're playing games at home in Pittsburgh, we're playing games anywhere in the AFC and it's cold outside, the guy that you want in the backfield is Najee Harris because he's putting pain on guys as well as giving you 4 and 5 yards a pop. So I think that's somebody that's definitely going to be a bell cow for us, somebody that's going to really help us get to the promised land. But I promise you Jaylen Warren is going to be there as well because he's also going to, as you start to get worn down and you're like, man, I don't feel like dealing with this guy Najee anymore, you give Jaylen the ball, boom, he pops out for 60. He pops out for 50. And I think that's a great balance of what you need in the backfield.
And that's something that, you mentioned it when it gets cold. That translates in December. It translates in January, too. And when it starts happening in January, you're on the right track to some things. Let's go to Derek in Pittsburgh. Derek, you're on the Nightly Sports Call.
Thanks, Josh. Thanks for taking my call.
Appreciate you.
My question is, just wanted to know what you guys think of the potential fifth wide receiver the Steelers going to take this year. Obviously, Johnson, Pickens, Robinson, Austin III tied up there for the fourth. But if it's going to be Gunner or Boykin being that extra special teamer, what do you guys think?
That's a great question, Derek. Before we get to that answer, I want to point something out. We saw what Deontay Johnson could do in that first preseason game. We saw Kenny Pickett go to him 3 times in that first drive. That led to the George Pickens touchdown catch, and we saw what play that was. So we know what those guys can do, and we saw that early. Then you saw what Calvin Austin could do in the second half of that game, and that obviously was a good tribute to his skill set. Now we started to see what they can get from Allen Robinson. We saw that too, and I point Allen Robinson out because, Ryan, you're a guy that played against him at Ohio State when Allen Robinson was at Penn State. Your thoughts on adding that kind of veteran guy that we talked about before, another veteran leader, your thoughts on adding a guy like that creates more depth for this receiving corps?
The one thing I'm really excited about Allen Robinson with him joining this team is that like we've been saying this all day, he's a veteran presence. But the one thing that's really cool about Allen Robinson is when he was at the Bears, he was a #1 receiver. He was a Pro Bowl receiver. He ended up getting paid going to Los Angeles. Obviously, the situation didn't fit him well because him and Cooper Kupp both played the slot. But now with him coming back to Pittsburgh and getting that slot role, I think that's going to be a great fit for him when it comes to being a piece of this offense, because now when you really look at it, Kenny has 3 jump ball receivers, and then now he has an elite route runner. And I think any quarterback would take that any given day. You have elite route runner in Deontay Johnson. You have a jump ball guy with Pat Freiermuth. You have a jump ball guy with Kenny Pickett. And then now you have another contested jump ball guy with Allen Robinson. To me, I think that's something that all quarterbacks love, all quarterbacks want. And I'm really excited about that. And then you have Calvin Austin, who's just going to run past anybody that gets in front of him. So I think that's also pretty cool. But when we get back to your question about that last receiver spot, honestly, I still don't think that decision is made yet because we still have this 3rd preseason game. And, when you think about special teams, Boykins did an amazing job on special teams last year, so it might be a whole different role for him instead of actually playing receiver, more as a gunner and a special teams guy. But we actually might see somebody in this last preseason game that might step up and actually earn their spot for this 5th spot. So I think this is a spot that's still up for grabs. I don't think that they have a lock on Miles. They have a lock on Gunner, and it's a lot of other young pieces that still have an opportunity to make this team.
Yeah, and you've heard this saying before, and I'm sure you've understood this better than anybody. that usually in the 4-game preseason, granted we're down to 3 games now, but in that 4-game preseason, the 3rd game is usually the dress rehearsal. That's when the starters are getting that last bit of time in there. They're trying to get themselves, ready to go. But then that 4th preseason game, that last preseason game, that's when guys are earning jobs. And that's probably when we'll see that 5th receiver spot that you're talking about being earned. We'll probably see that as far as the defensive backfield, maybe a running back or two, and they brought one in this week, and he tried to make a big impact as well. So we're going to see the opportunities for some of those spots that might be open at the bottom of the roster maybe get filled in that 3rd preseason game.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, and that's one thing that I don't like anymore is that they only have 3 preseason games, but I know that players like it because it's not as much wear and tear on your body, but then it's also opportunities that's getting lost for some other guys. But we're going to see that in this 3rd preseason game. We're going to see some guys make plays, and not just at the receiver position. We might see that last running back come in because Anthony McFarland, he's still fighting for this last position. He's still fighting for his spot. You still have young DBs who are fighting for spots, and what people fail to realize is that with the practice squad getting bigger, it's allowing more opportunities for guys to get film around and allow them the opportunity to get on the practice squad as well. So let's just not think about, hey, just guys that made the roster. It might be a guy that end up on the practice squad and mess around and be the Alejandro Villanueva and end up being a critical role in a year or two.
Yeah, you hear coaches talk about it. I mean, sometimes you're not just playing for the job you have right now. Sometimes you're playing for that next job, that next team that might see you on film and might want to bring you along. So as much as you can talk about whether or not guys will make this roster, even if they don't, they might end up on another roster based on what they do, like that tape you're talking about in that 3rd preseason game. So, even for a guy who probably seems like a long shot, there's still a lot to play for because you never know where you can end up, and you never know who's actually watching what you do. We got to take another break. We're taking more phone calls when we come back. We're answering questions. We might get to a tweet or two. We'll do that when we come back. Stick around.